much as I absolutely hate doing so. Okay, guys, so tonight, obviously, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about labor unions, and then we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about inequality, and then we'll shift to looking at some of the elements from the prior 6 modules that may be on the exam. And largely, I need that to be question-driven, because let's face it, in the time allotted, I can't really do a brief recitation of every one of the concepts we've dealt with, some of which I think you're more comfortable with than others. Okay? So I want to go through as much of that as we need to tonight. So let's start with labor unions. Talk to me about labor unions. What's the goods, the bads, the requirements, etc. for them? Do we love them? Do we hate them?
They do good and bad, essentially.
Okay. Well, that's about as bipolar as we can get here tonight. At least tell me about the good.
So in the short term, labor unions are good because they increase benefits, wages for workers. Long term, the market will try to adjust for the loss of paying workers more, and workers will have to pay that in the market where they live.
Because of increased prices? That may well be true. Increased input prices may give us a spiral effect for inflation. Have we ever seen that?
Yes.
When?
Just recently in Logan, there was a senator who wanted certified mail for billing, specifically medical billing. So doctors, rather than take a cut, will increase prices to pay for the fact that they have to pay $6 every time for certified mail.
Okay.
So that will be passed on to patients. So that was pretty recently, last year.
Okay. We've seen it more on the macro.
In the 70s and 80s.
Very outwardly, right? We actually saw it heavily in the 40s and 50s as well. Just that we didn't see the other effect that we saw in the 70s and 80s, and that was an increase in interest rates to kind of counteract it. So in the 70s and 80s, we saw the increase in wages, largely as a function of 2 factors: union strength. That was really the halcyon of union days, if you will. And then we saw wages rise, we saw prices rise. We also had a double effect there of having just come out of the Vietnam conflict. So we had a tremendous amount of debt in the marketplace that had to be paid off. And so we started to see some inflation from that as well, because the debt meant that we created a lot of money. And so we saw inflation from a macro policy standpoint there. And then we saw Volcker increase interest rates to try to counteract that, because what we were looking at was stagflation, which is second only in terrible to outright depression. And arguably unions have an awful lot to do with the cause of all of that. Remember, have you seen enough of the video to have seen my personal feelings about unions? Love them, hate them. Absolutely despise them, don't want to live in an economy that doesn't have the shadow of them. Why would that be, Joel?
Well, the shadow of them, like somewhere out there's a union that deals with your industry.
Or and maybe it's very small today, but it could very quickly be very large again. So it's almost like the threat of them, right? And I hate to use that term, but I'm not sure that that's the wrong term.
Since every employer has a bit of monopoly power, and you as an input don't have a lot of bargaining power alone, if you ever had a need to band together to bargain, you'd have to do it collectively, because you as an individual you wouldn't have the monopoly power.
Right. As an individual worker, do any of us in a perfect or relatively imperfect market, do any of us have much power? No. It's when a whole bunch of us get together, right? that power tends to become ours collectively, as you pointed. We have an interesting scenario taking place right now that we're just at the very early stages of seeing how this may play out. Do any of you know what happened when General Motors went through the staged bankruptcy, came back to life, and who became the initial owners of General Motors at that point in time?
Unions.
Yeah, in fact, the unions became a substantial owner of the common shares of the company because they gave up a lot in terms of some pension plans and some value. So they took common shares in exchange for that. The bondholders, which in some respects were also you, gave up a lot, and so they ended up with some common stock. And then the U.S. government ended up with common stock, right? And I think that last I knew, the government has sold off most of its common shares to General Motors. My guess is that it probably by now has sold off the remainder of them, but I don't pay that much attention to it. What I think is interesting is that we still end up in a situation, and I'm not going to be exactly right on my numbers here, but I'm not going to be terribly far off. I think that the AFL-CIO, the major labor union that governs auto workers, if I remember correctly, ended up with a 37% ownership stake in the new General Motors. That is not trivial. I mean, that's enormous, right? So think about now the next time there is a union negotiation to take place. Who sits on which side of the table? The union is labor, and the union is management. That's kind of interesting. And we've never seen that in this economy. We've seen this in some Northern European economies. We've seen it in some respects in some former Soviet bloc economies, and we're now seeing little bits of it in Chinese economies, but with a different underlayment. There is no expectation of equity, purely free capitalist market outcomes. But so this is going to be interesting over the next number of years as we kind of see this play out. Why do we suppose that union membership and union power has declined so much since late 70s, early 80s when it reached its pinnacle? Yeah?
Because of the PAC code from Reagan.
Okay, so tell us about that.
So the air traffic controllers were going on strike, and Reagan said, don't do it or you'll lose your job and you won't be able to come back. And they left, not believing his threat, and so he hired air traffic controllers from Vietnam. And they tried to get their jobs back, and they weren't allowed to, and
Oh well, right?
yeah, they had to do something different.
Was it Reagan and the PATCO decision that really was the issue there, or was there something that allowed Reagan to make the PATCO decision and have it stick? That's really the issue.
Wording on the contract.
Well, that's part of it.
I'd say social turmoil with labor unions having too much power, because then they start losing, as you mentioned, just with that scenario with what side of the table of the bargaining table you're sitting at, right? And so, like, as the labor union gets too powerful, do they really have the workers' best interests in heart? Because you'd have people, my dad and my parents, they tried to get out of those labor unions. My grandpa was in the railroad for numerous years, and the Pacific, it was a big labor union they were part of, but they weren't seeing it on their level. It was certain locales that seemed to have their representation, not everywhere. So, as you said, the social turmoil causes the changes.
Yeah, and that social turmoil, I think, was driven in part because as unions became so powerful, they have resources and abilities that they'd never enjoyed before. And anytime that's the case for any group of people, it typically just is taken too far, right? I mean, can you name for me the head of any labor union today? I wouldn't think so. Can you name for me the head of any labor union ever? Jimmy Hoffa. Anybody else? Chavez for the farm workers. Ed Meany. Okay. These are names from the late 70s, early 1980s, and even before then, right? because they didn't just arrive on the scene at that point. They've been working within these organizations for decades. And one of the things that's kind of interesting about labor unions is this issue of elasticity, right? So we know that labor unions would prefer to unionize inelastic workers, but labor unions typically unionize elastic workers. Why? Why? Any idea?
Elastic workers are more substitutable, so they need the representation, so they don't get replaced by like technology or.
And so their own skill set doesn't protect them well, right? Whereas the inelastic worker, the highly inelastic worker, their skill set protects them on a relative basis at the very least, if not on an absolute basis, right? What is currently the largest functioning labor union in the country? Any idea?
Government?
Be more specific if you can. There's two that come to mind. We don't really think of immediately.
Post office?
No, teachers' unions, because they all belong to a larger collective, okay, even though there are state versions of them. There's actually a couple of different competing labor unions in some states, but as they move on up the chain, they're all still part of the same collectives. That's probably technically the largest in terms of the number of workers. Postal employees come in there, government service workers come in there somewhere as well. And since the teachers' union is the largest in terms of number of employees and number of covered workers by the contracts, it probably also today enjoys the highest budget in terms of union dues, right? That lets it then spend the most money on lobbying and such, and we see that. In fact, we really see that anytime the Utah legislature goes into session, right? We see it in a big way. I'm not sure that that's necessarily bad in how we see it, but we see it. There's another one that we don't often think about as a labor union because it doesn't promote itself as one, but happens to be one of the most influential labor unions in our lives. Any ideas what I'm talking about? Well, that actually does promote itself as a labor union, and it is insignificant in terms of its scale and budget today compared to the one I'm thinking about. No? The American Medical Association. Is that a labor union? It's a professional association of physicians that pay dues, that affects research, that gets involved in Medicare contracts, gets involved in hospital negotiations, gets involved in setting the number of seats in medical school, so the supply of new physicians, gets involved in laws in every state in the country, and not just laws, but in terms of what drugs we can take, what drugs we can't take, what we pay for them. It is probably one of the most pervasive non-union labor unions that exist. Extraordinarily powerful. Does that surprise us, given the probable inelasticity of physicians?
It's kind of weird.
Kind of, huh?
Because they're inelastic, so you would think that, I don't know, they wouldn't need a union necessarily?
Not as overtly as, say, the service workers or maybe even school teachers, right? So why is it? What's caused that to be able to come about with the kind of power and influence it has? Because I promise you, every one of us is heavily influenced by that labor union. The Affordable Care Act, heavily influenced by that labor union.
That type of work gets a higher income, could they grab a little bit of that?
Well, they do grab a little bit of that. I mean, their dues, if you will, are not labor union dues, they're member fees, right? Same thing. But again, these are inelastic workers that can protect themselves, but that tend to coalesce as groups, nonetheless. We tend to have doctors form clinics. we tend to have hospitals with numerous physicians and other healthcare workers that may well fit under that same umbrella. So they coalesce nonetheless, which is a little bit unusual for highly skilled workers. Most highly skilled workers don't coalesce, don't form bodies like that. And because that body formed, then it recognized the ability to do what it didn't start as a labor union. In fact, it still doesn't call itself a labor union. But I see it as probably the most influential, most pervasive labor union in the country. And having been trained as a labor economist, you know, I guess I see a lot of things as nails when maybe they're not necessarily nails. Okay? Or at least I use a lot of hammers, maybe that's a better way to put it. Okay, so are there any spillover effects of labor unions?
Benefits for people within the market.
Okay. Do we know of any benefits that we enjoy today as workers in a common society that are the byproduct of a labor union's activity at some point in the last 100 years? Minimum wage? Overtime? Yeah. So many of our OSHA standards for safety, OSHA itself was formed as a byproduct of a guy named Sam Gompers having a patented fit before the U.S. House of Representatives and Senate. Did you see my reference or hear my reference to Gompers in the videos? You seen that, Steve?
I did.
Okay. I love that guy's name. You know, and it was a long time ago. This was like in the 1860s. But I like the name. I just like saying the name, Sam Gompers. Kind of like Gomer Pyle. Right? I want more. I just want more. And labor unions have effectively gotten more. But we tend now to still give more to workers in some respects than we did, even without the presence of significant labor unions supporting them. We now are in a situation we see in many states, minimum wage rising to $15 an hour, or in some states $22 an hour over a period of years. We saw the application of virtually a universal health care system to cover all workers at some of those workers' expense and sometimes taxpayer expense.